Scott, can you give us, you said in the beginning we'll have a state agency panel, local government, compost industry panel, science panel, and then we'll go to the comment cards. Can you just, as opposed to doing them one at a time, just say everybody in a panel so they know what order they're coming up in? Unless you're done on state agency now.
We're done with the state agency. We had Dr. Howard Levinson with CalRecycle that wanted to make a statement about their perspective, and then we were going to go into the panels here so I could have them come up one at a time. Is that what?
Yeah, just so long as everybody knows the whole set of players and then how they'll come up. It's just one of those things where you want the intro to the story versus it being a mystery each time until the name is called.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and board members. I am Howard Levinson. I'm Deputy Director at CalRecycle, and I'd like to give you our perspective on this order and a couple of other broad issues. Our priorities with this order, of course, are to work with you on protecting groundwater. That's first and foremost in our minds, but we also have our own mandates regarding diversion of organics from landfills, and I wanted to give you a sense of what some of those policy drivers are. And then speak a little bit about land application in particular. On the policy drivers on organics, we have our own Assembly Bill 341, which established a 75% reduction goal by 2020. We're working on that very diligently. Associated with that is the work we're doing with the Air Resources Board on the scoping plan, and the Air Resources Board focus on getting organics out of landfills because of the methane emissions from landfills. And that's also reflected in the new short-lived climate pollutant paper that the Air Board just released, and it calls for getting 90% of organics out of landfills by 2025. Jenny also spoke to the Healthy Soils Initiative. We're very pleased to be part of that and agree that that's a really critical effort for all of us to be working collaboratively on, so I won't speak more about that. In terms of diversion from landfills, we generally prefer that be done by managing organics to what we think are their best use. And for us, that really speaks to focusing on composting and anaerobic digestion, using these materials as feedstocks. These are both biological processes, relatively controlled processes, and they both have regulatory frameworks that have been established or are being improved upon as we speak. It's going to take a lot of these kinds of facilities. These are expansions of composting facilities or new anaerobic digestion facilities to meet that 75% goal, and clearly they've got to be protective of groundwater and other environmental concerns. Scott spoke at the beginning about the very many benefits that composting can provide, particularly in terms of soil organic material for healthy soils, water conservation in terms of building healthy soils, erosion control and improving groundwater quality, pest management, a lot of other things. If these materials go into anaerobic digestion facilities, they're able to produce biofuels or bioenergy in states. So we have a lot of positive sides of composting. I think that's important to keep in mind when I speak in a moment about land application. We are okay with land application as a use, although we prefer composting and anaerobic digestion. But that land application has got to be done with appropriate controls on contaminants and with appropriate oversight on application. Within our own regulatory authority, for example, we are exerting more control over land application. I'll come back to that at the very end to just let you know where we are on our own regulatory process. So this order adds some additional measures on composting facility that are protective of groundwater quality. We're in general agreement with the intent of the order, but I do want to note that it's, at least with respect to groundwater quality, it's primarily based on threat, not on documented data showing groundwater pollution. So that is a concern. And we do have additional comments on specific provisions of the order that
I don't understand that. Are you saying
It's not a problem?
No,
well,
it
or
is a
that we
problem
should
that we
wait
definitely
for
need.
us to
No.
find it happening? That caught my attention. I think I understand what you were just saying.
It's absolutely, certainly appropriate to be regulating in terms of looking at threat, but we just don't have any data showing that there are actual instances of groundwater and leachate coming off of composting facilities and showing groundwater contamination. So it's just something to keep in mind.
don't want to be in the company with people that make that argument all the time. I just want to say, because that was true of every phase of regulation. Just so you know, because you're stepping into a field that every entity that gets regulated for the first time says, and part of that is because we haven't been regulating it, just as a word to the wise. But I get your point, but just as a word to the wise.
And we do have at least 3, if not more, enforcement actions, which we will hear about, I assume, later.
Taken. We do have some additional comments on the order that we have provided to your staff, and I know we're working with them closely, and so we'll be looking forward to seeing what kinds of changes they wish to make on that. More broadly, though, it's our perspective that the economic consequences of the order may have some increased push for more land application, and that's a point where we don't totally agree with the staff's analysis. For us, the economic analysis is not consistent with what we know of the industry in terms of profit margins, and so we're really at a loss to explain some of the findings on the economic analysis. And based on some of the conversations that we've been hearing anecdotally, we see that there's going to probably be more push to move organics to land application. And that raises some concerns for us, even more so than potential threats from the composting facilities themselves. For us, land application is less desirable from an environmental standpoint than would be the application of compost in a controlled situation. In our view, land application has comparatively higher risks and fewer benefits than using compost for a soil amendment or using the organics for an anaerobic digestion facility. So we do encourage the board to look for ways in the order to provide some additional flexibility so that facilities can come into compliance or be in compliance with the general order while still protecting groundwater quality and not moving off that goal at all. We also look forward to working with the state board and the regional boards along with CDFA on the land application policy issue to make sure that we've got sufficient protection of water quality, and that we're also able to continue to appropriately manage organics that are diverted from landfills. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is. Just as we need to collaborate on the Healthy Soils Initiative, we also need to be working together, State Water Board, regional boards, CDFA and CalRecycle and others on this issue of land application and making sure that we have sufficient oversight on that activity. I'll just wrap up by speaking a little bit about CalRecycle's own regulations. We're in the last stages of the formal rulemaking process to revise the regulations for facilities and activities associated with handling organic materials, specifically for composting and digestion. We expect to submit the revised regulations to the Office of Administrative Law prior to October. And those regulations do a number of things, but they do revise the definitions of material types and some of the permit requirements. They provide a better set of tools to the local enforcement agents to determine when illegal disposal is happening. This is particularly where we're concerned about the land application situation and some of the enforcement orders that we're aware that have happened at the regional, with the regional boards. And we want to make sure that we're enhancing those tools so we can stop that. And the regulations also include additional methods to address chronic odors at composting sites. We've gotten a lot of input from state water board staff and regional board staff on those regulations, so we appreciate that, and we're hoping to get those wrapped up pretty quickly. So thank you for your attention this afternoon, and happy to answer any questions.
Another area where we may find collaboration very helpful will be, but you have field staff, a lot of field staff, and we really don't. We have some, but probably not enough. And so maybe we can work on a way in which it would be useful to you to when your field staff are going to a facility, they can look at more than one thing, and we can we can work a way to do that.
As the working group on land application really gets going, I think that's one of the areas where we can collaborate on education outreach using, our staff, the local enforcement agents, your staff, wherever it's appropriate, and try and get that word out. So that's one area for sure.
So I have another suggestion as well, and I think we'll probably hear about this from the industry panel, but it seems to me that although staff has gone to great strides to provide for flexibility in the proposed order, it seems that and I don't want to speak for them, but it seems that there are a number of facilities that feel that there's not enough flexibility, that, for example, that they would have to install a pad, a concrete pad at great expense, for example. So anything that you could do to work with our staff and the regulated community to see that there are other options that would be as protective. I mean, that was the idea anyway, in providing other options in the order.
We're happy to play whatever role we can in facilitating that. We've certainly been working with your staff and with the industry. And some of the comments, there are 3 or 4 comments that we provided to staff in terms of additional suggestions, do reflect some of the concerns that the industry's provided, and in terms of pad and requirements on cover for some things. So there's a few suggestions where it may be possible to work some additional flexibility in.
You mentioned that in the new proposed regs, there's some modifications of definitions. Would those modifications impact the definitions in this proposed order at this time?
Many of the new definitions that were proposed, we included that or revised them. Now, if they change that, I don't, but we try to, as best possible, do that collaborative. I mean, as far as look at their definitions and
Packages have been moving kind of like this together, so we've always been connecting as best we can to make sure things are consistent.
I appreciate that effort of synchronization. It's consistent
trying.
with our action plan is to sync up with our sister agencies. So that's one example. Well, I'm struck by, in learning about this issue, and as you point out, from Cal Recycle's perspective, this is an area of significant growth in the next few years and demand. And it reminds me of an issue we took up last month, which was establishing protective requirements for intake and discharge of ocean seawater for desalination facilities, with the idea, and there's a lot of pressure to look at that. There aren't very many of them. There's maybe going to be more, but it was important for us to make sure that we establish long-term sustainable protective measures in that type of endeavor, and I see a clear parallel here. So thank you for your partnership.
Okay, so next up we have the industry panel that is Matthew Cotton, Neil Edgar, Chuck Helgett, and Jeff Creek. Then we have met actually all of those individuals in separate workshops after this draft. And I was just going to have them come up to the area where we are, and we'll do the different panels.
Lights on. Oh, is that better? Because when I said good evening, that was funny, and people should have laughed at that. So, good evening, Madam Chair, members of the board, staff, distinguished guests, composters, anyone who's left in the building. Thank you so much for indulging this workshop. I think we have some great folks here to say a lot of things. I really do appreciate having this workshop. I believe I started engaging this process in version 0 back in '96 with different folks at the Central Valley or Central Coast Regional Board, later with Ed Wasker here at the State Board, Central Valley folks. Seems like we've been talking about this for a long, long time. I've been asked, weirdly enough, I was actually asked to be on the science panel because I teach composting for a lot of folks, the U.S. Composting Council, SWANA, some other folks. I've never been asked to teach composting in 5 minutes. I'm going to give it a shot. When we teach composting, one of the most critical things we talk about is balance. And I really think this whole exercise, I do appreciate this is taking a lot of time, a lot of staff effort, a lot of interagency coordination to get it right, because it is important and it's really hard. We've got these competing goals. I don't think anybody that I work with in the composting industry has any interest in degrading water quality whatsoever. I think they would be surprised to find out that they were unregulated. I've heard staff say that 3 times today, that there are some facilities that are perhaps unregulated by the state board directly from a WDR standpoint. Most of them that I'm aware of have stormwater management plans, the smaller ones especially. The large ones have had WDRs for many, many years. Some of these facilities go back to the early 1990s or before. So to say that they're unregulated is, I get the context of it. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't be. I think we're, not to speak for the rest of my folks, most of us are generally mostly happy with the generally order. There's a few details, and my last slide will be some wish lists on that. I hope we can continue to work with each other as this evolves. I do want to make a point to the gentleman's position about desalinization. If we get a wet year next year, we'll probably forget about that. And similarly, well, we'll see. The fact is, CalRecycle has been promoting composting and saying we need 200 new facilities, 100 new facilities, and the different regional air boards, particularly the South Coast and the San Joaquin Valley, implemented 2 very stringent rules recently, and there hasn't been a new facility since. And if you're wondering whether or not direct land application is happening, because there seems to be some question about whether or not that's going to happen or increase, you can wonder, and I have a slide later about the Puente Hills landfill and where that 1,000 tons a day of green waste went, because there's no new composting sites, and yet somehow 1,000 tons a day has disappeared. It's not going to composting. And there aren't any new WDRs about it, but it's going somewhere. So it's a mystery. Look at that. I was asked to talk some real basic content, so I apologize if some of this is review for some of you, but what composting does is take this, unstable, putrescible, hard to manage, unstorable material and creates this fantastic product with lots and lots of uses. I think you all know that. It's key and critical to the healthy soil movement. Why is it important? Of course, it's critical to the state's ambitious goals. We have significant water savings, and I expect Craig Kalaji will talk a lot about that later. Significant water savings by using compost, significant greenhouse gas benefits from using compost, keeping organic out of landfills, and really critical to recycling nutrients. This is way too much to understand, but this is a very comprehensive global paper that was just published recently in Science, talking about how we're running out of phosphorus and nitrogen. So it's really, really important to recycle nutrients. This is a critical thing if we still think in the future we want to eat food, and I think we do. Fundamentally, composting is a biological process, as has been said before. We take organic matter, minerals, our feedstocks, mix them, add water and oxygen, and time. We have some emissions that come off, and then we make compost. It's a biological process. We have different feedstocks we work on. It's predominantly aerobic, and it's predominantly how we manage organics in California. There are 130 or so composting facilities, maybe a dozen AD facilities. So this is primarily how these materials will be managed now and in the future. But it's a 40-plus year old treatment process invented really in the modern composting world by USDA and EPA after we tried to get biosolids out of the ocean. So it's well known, it's well established, we know how it works. They can be big, they can be small, they can be at landfills, they can be at wastewater treatment plants. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and they process all sorts of different feedstocks. And I think that's something, to some extent, that's been lost in the general order. This graph is great, except that it really overstates the size of the facilities. They are not that big. That's just trying to show the relative size. There are some big ones, there are some small ones, a couple AD facilities. This overstates how big they are and the impact they have. If we are to meet the goals that the governor has set, the people of California want, we're going to need a lot more facilities, and that's incredibly challenging in this effort, as others will speak to as far as the economic challenges. As has been said, most are adjunct to other activities at a landfill, at a wastewater treatment plant. There are, in fact, standalone compost facilities, but they're probably in the minority. Many are partially subsidized by municipal rates or other things, the availability of which, as Howard's group is more and more successful, there's less and less of that money to spread across, so the economics are getting more and more challenging. And Chuck and Neil will talk about that. And we're being asked to do more and more at a time when it's harder and we have tougher regulatory challenges. We're up for that challenge, but there is an elasticity to waste materials that if you make them too expensive, they will just go to the landfill. We have to live within this very low ceiling of cost. We can't compost at $300 a ton. We're just making soil amendment. It's not going to be gold. It's not aluminum. It's just compost. It's awesome, but it's not expensive. So, CalRecycle's done 3 infrastructure studies. I happen to be involved in all of them. Most of the compost is in fact going to agriculture, and I think that's a critical key. It can do a lot in agriculture. I'm sure with other speakers talking about how much it can do in rangelands and other spots, but it really does have a lot of benefits. This is some work, again, funded by CalRecycle, showing major significant benefits in 4 areas to adding compost to soils. Water holding capacity, perhaps the most important or the most critical in this audience, but the storage of carbon, obviously very significant. And this is 2011. This seems like ancient history, but really good stuff that CalRecycle's done. I wasn't sure if I had time to get to this slide. This is my rendering of what LA County Sanitation Districts put out as their plan for where stuff was going post Puente Hills. And the green arrows are direct land application. So I don't know if you trust the people at Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts. They're generally pretty reputable folks. And they said they're going to send green waste everywhere but where they are, and even some in LA. So we've got to do something about this. It's a bad policy. It's bad for the state. It's spreading imported pests. Thousands of tons are going onto land without any oversight from you or CalRecycle or anybody else as far as we can tell. I know there are efforts afoot to try to work on that, and that's great. So what that looks like, and sure, it can be done responsibly. I don't know that mostly it is or not. I just know a lot of tons are disappearing, and we'd really much rather see them composted. For a lot of different reasons. It's better policy, it's more stable, and you get the benefits from it. That, in this case, again, when widely unregulated, we talk, I appreciate your point, Dr. Marcus, about the slippery slope of regulated and not regulated and where that goes, but right now, the vast majority of manure in the state is vaguely regulated and going directly applied to land. The vast majority of green waste, particularly in Southern California, unregulated, going to land. Vast majority of food processing waste, unregulated, going to land. So to focus on composting is important, but it also puts a spotlight on us when the majority of these tons are not being composted. So we hope they will be, but if you make it too expensive, we're going to get more of this. So I think that's all I have. Oh yeah, well this was one quick point I just wanted to show. This state is so big you can't even fit it on a slide. I tried, and I couldn't Photoshop that into one slide. This is really critical, and Scott, I'm sorry, I've said this since, I don't know, every workshop I've been to, and I've been to almost all the workshops over the past 10 years. This is a really big state. It has really different average precipitation. It's got really different depths to groundwater. It's got really different soil types. It's got really different feedstocks. We've got different compost processes. So to try to create a statewide general order is really hard. I don't think there's any more wanted and yet less realized goal in this building than to do permit streamlining. I've been hearing that for as long as I've been in this building. And back when CalRecycle was over on Cal Center Drive, we talked about permit streamlining. It's an awesome goal. I do a lot of permitting. Neil does a lot of permitting. It's really hard to do permit streamlining. I don't think this order as written right now will actually provide permit streamlining. It's great to hear from the regional boards that it will. I'll be curious to see if that happens. I think a lot of folks would rather take their chances with an individual order and look at the specificity that their site requires, given that it's a very big state with very different conditions, very different feedstocks, very different scales. That's not to say we haven't worked diligently and continually and ongoingly with the state to try to make the order something that works for everybody, and I hope we get to continue to do that. I think there's a couple other points. I would love to have more flexibility. And what I mean by flexibility, I'm really talking about existing WDRs. It's very unclear to me, and I didn't think we were going to get into this level of minutia, but you haven't cut me off yet, so I'm going to keep going.
You're taking your colleagues'
They
time.
love me. That's good.
Should look to them.
The reality, it's really hard to tell what the board's intent is as far as existing WDRs. And a lot of composting sites are on sites with existing WDRs. It'd be great to clarify that. I think the redefinition of water as completely wastewater. We asked for them to redefine water at composting sites. We did not ask for it all to be lumped into wastewater, and that's a problem. So there's a couple other issues, but I will cede my time at this point to Mr. Helgett. Thank you so much. Or Neil. Yeah. No, other side. Flip it over. Flip it over. No, flip it over. There you go.
On. We'll wait for my presentation. And I'm Neil Edgar with I'm Executive Director of the California Compost Coalition. My clients are green waste and food waste composting operators up and down the state who want to see reasonable rules. Where nobody is up here advocating for water impairment. We're most of the composters that I've been working with for years have started because they were environmentalists at heart. They wanted to do the right thing for their communities and saw this as an opportunity to help move the ball forward on sustainability. There we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the regulatory challenges that are out there. It turns out the Water Board is not the only one who is regulating composting facilities. A little bit about the market challenges and particular land application, which has been talked about. I'll show you a little bit about organic resource technology options that are out there, and then a little bit more about what the costs are. And I have about a 15-minute presentation in 2 minutes. Thanks, Matt. So we have local land use issues when we're developing facilities. You have public sector landfills, which are traditionally very low-cost options. And when I get into the costs, I'll talk a little bit more about that. You have these new calorie cycle regulations, which will increase the cost of composting. There are physical contaminant limits that are going to come into play over the next several years that are going to add significant cost of processing. So the cost of composting is going to go up. You have local air district rules in South Coast.
So I have to ask, what are nopes and bananas?
So nopes are not on planet Earth, and bananas are build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. And those folks come to play during the CEQA process and during the recycle permitting process.
There are times when not everyone in the industry has been a good neighbor, because I was involved in regulating the air side of it. I saw horror stories. I know you all are perfect.
And I'll talk about...
Many are, and it's out of good, but it's not like there haven't been issues.
Nope, that's not. I'm not saying there haven't been, and like any industry, there are excellent operators and there are marginal operators, and discerning between the two from a regulator standpoint sometimes is difficult. So Cali Air Resources Board has implemented AB 32 greenhouse gas regulations. Howard talked about the short-lived climate pollutants. We all know the wonderful things that composting can do to save the planet. There are carbon credits have been developed by the Climate Action Reserve for removing those organics from landfills, and odors continue to be a challenge for composting facilities. And then we have a brand new industrial stormwater permit in addition to these WDRs. There are a lot of cheap alternatives to composting. So as Howard talked about, you have land application. Landfill alternative daily cover is continuing to be counted as diversion. So waste is covered up daily at landfill operations to prevent vectors, birds, other environmental hazard. And that will continue to be counted as diversion until 2020. Chipping and grinding operations, one of the reasons we've focused on having equity for chipping and grinding operations was not to have staff exempt that portion of your composting site from regulation. The reason we asked for that to be regulated is because those are the same materials composters are taking. They have a constant pile of material, just like a composting operation, that presents a threat to water quality, and that material goes to land application. And representatives from Southern California will tell you that up to 80% of the curbside collected green waste in Southern California goes to direct land app. Matt illustrated that with his graphic about the Puente Hills landfill closure, but that material Some of it goes to irrigated croplands. Some of it goes to what I would consider just horizontal landfills. And it doesn't take long to find those. The first 2 hours I was in Chino about 5 years ago, I had a couple hours to kill before a meeting. Drove around and you could see, a large 53-foot trailer, walking floor, back up next to a farm field site and discharge its load full of plastic and other litter. And if I can find them in an hour, I'm not sure where the regulators are, but the rules are muddy. So it's largely unregulated. CDFA doesn't want to have anything to do with it. The LEAs don't have authority until Cal Recycle adopts these new regulations. And regional water quality control boards, you could probably tell me better. So this is a food safety issue. There's pathogen transfer taking place. It's a significant pathway for invasive pest transfer. And millions of tons of yard waste are being managed this way right now. When Matt said 1,000 tons a day, it's 1,000 tons a day, not 1,000 tons. This is a huge problem. So composting, you have your traditional windrow facilities. These are newer aerated static pile technologies. On the top there is a biosolids facility up in Canada that is using this aerated static pile technology for a dozen years. It's not new technology. Below is a bunkered system. This is a facility in Washington State. They put a 220,000 square foot roof over the top of it to help meet some of the water quality concerns, as well as be able to put a process in place that mitigated odors. You have in-vessel. You can do it in a box. And as I go through these, the cost of employing these mechanisms goes up. You have wet anaerobic digestion, largely occurring in tanks and at wastewater treatment facilities. And you have dry anaerobic digestion, which is a cutting-edge new technology. There are only a couple of facilities in the state where you can put these materials inside these chambers, extract the gases off of them, convert them into methane. They can be converted to natural gas, and you can fuel the same vehicles that picked up the waste in the first place. Wonderful systems. We've gotten some grants from the Energy Commission in order to help make these facilities a reality on the ground. But the comparative economics don't work out. So chipping and grinding, going to ADC, $8 to $15 a ton. If you take it out to land application, depending on how far you have to transport it, $10 to $20 a ton. Across the state, landfilling, MRFs, transfer stations are pretty wide. It's a pretty wide range. But up on the North Coast, landfilling is over $100 a ton. In Sonoma, they've had problems with the landfill there. Composting windrows are $25 to $35 a ton. If we implement, and again, going back to the economic considerations, it's one thing for staff to estimate that $25.2 million is all that's going to need to be expended on composting to meet this order. That presupposes that no pads are going to need to be installed anywhere, and that's not reality either, and that none of these other technologies are going to need to be employed. So while the cost of composting with a fully compliant facility tend to go up significantly. Anaerobic digesters cost a little bit more than that, and you still have to compost the digestate largely, or you're going to have a marginal quality product. So Sonoma Compost, the facility at the landfill there, is been determined will be closed this year to meet water quality concerns. A Clean Water Act lawsuit by neighbors there was the fulcrum by which the facility ended up, determination was made a couple weeks ago to close it. The replacement facility, which I provided to a staff report from the local authority, is going to cost $45 million, largely to address water quality issues. It's going to be 7.5 acres under a roof, 10 acres of paving, a small pond. The nice part about that $45 million is it really doesn't include the cost of the land underneath it, because it's at the landfill, and it doesn't include a full monitoring program or lined pond, because those are already embedded within the landfill infrastructure. They've estimated that at full build-out, the facility costs about $52.94 a ton to design, build, and operate. The first phase at $67.24 a ton. Significant cost. A model facility we worked on here locally. We believe the water board staff did a good job on estimating the cost of installing the ponds and the pads, and we've used some of their metrics in developing this facility. A small facility, and again, 5,000 cubic yards exclusion is great, but that's a very tiny facility. typical facility, to make it economically viable, needs to be somewhere between 25 and 100,000 cubic yards now. But again, this is a $19 million facility to help, again, put in these kinds of technology options in order to meet not only water quality but air quality and other measures. So the economic considerations were wholly inadequate. $25.2 million to talk about upgrading facilities statewide to meet this is that's a minimum. That's the least it could possibly cost. And the reality is it's going to be more than that. So the solutions are out there, but we need to figure out how to pay for them, or we're just not going to be able to grow the industry. Matt and I have been doing this a long time. When you talk about permitting 100 facilities, you know, combined we have almost 40 years of compost permitting. We haven't seen 100 facilities permitted during that time. So appreciate your attention.
No, thank you. Now, you guys are failing in time management as a team, but we failed today in time management as a team as well. So
You can see the clock.
mindful of the fact that there's a room full of people, some of whom want to speak, you guys each get 5 minutes. And then I would suggest the other panel sort of hopefully has allocated their time and will keep to it, because I don't know what you've allocated, so I can't help be the time cop. 20 total, but I didn't know what they had allocated to the first two, so I couldn't be helpful. Just saying.
Madam Chair, members of the board, Chuck Helgett with Republic Services, and I've thrown out 3 pages of my presentation, so I will try to do it in 2 minutes if I can. Thank you for your patience. And thank you for the opportunity to comment on the general order for compost operations. California has recently enacted AB 1826, and you've heard, I think, a litany of several policy initiatives. I'm going to cover those briefly again because they are, I think, very important to keep in mind. 1826 establishes a mandatory commercial organics recycling program. AB 1594 phases out diversion credits for green waste ADC. We are also in the process right now, the industry, of implementing AB 341. This bill establishes a mandatory commercial recycling and a 75% recycling goal for the state. CalRecycle is also implementing a strategic directive 6.1, which calls for reducing organic waste disposal by 50% by 2020. According to CalRecycle, significant gains in organic waste diversion are necessary to meet the 75% goal in the strategic directive. The waste sector has also been at the forefront of Air Resources Board efforts to implement AB 32. CARB's policy initiatives in the various scoping plans and in the short-lived climate pollutants plan have increased the pressure on the waste sector to implement more programs for organics diversion to reduce methane emissions. And you heard today a very good presentation on the Healthy Soils Initiative. So taken together, these policy initiatives over the next 5 to 10 years will dramatically increase the amount of organics diverted from landfills and redirect those materials to organics processing facilities, composting operations, and anaerobic digestion. To achieve these clear state policy goals, it's estimated we're going to need to move an additional 6 to 10 million tons of organics from landfills, and as you've heard, 100 new facilities. This has to be done within 5 years. We make these points not in an effort to shirk our responsibility to convince you that water quality is somehow not important to us. In fact, it is very important. Rather, we make these points to request your understanding and support in balancing these sometimes conflicting policy goals. According to we appreciate that was one of my eliminated paragraphs, I'm sorry. We appreciate the time and effort taken by your staff to work with us on this general order. We have been involved in very productive exchanges with them. However, while we have seen many significant improvements in the general order, we firmly believe that more changes are needed if the state will ever develop the required organics processing and composting infrastructure that we need. I have very briefly 2 points. You heard about land application. I can assure you from experience that green waste and waste streams will flow to the path of least resistance and least cost. If composting operations aren't built, if composting operations are too expensive to build, it's going to go to land application.
But it sounds like it already is.
So, it already is, absolutely.
Right. So we aren't succeeding with what we've got. I mean, really.
I think the important thing to remember, though, it's going typically to land application where we don't have composting operations to take it. Northern California, not that big a deal. But Southern California it is. And we're going to see more of it. And I think that's the point that I would like to make. Yes, it is going, and I think it proves the point that you're going to get much, much more of this as we have increased pressure to handle more organics.
So if we're going to build 100 more facilities, shouldn't we make sure we're clear on what the proper design is to protect water quality from the beginning? And isn't this general order setting us up to do that, or what are we missing?
I forgot to say at the beginning, too, that we support the general order. We're not asking not to do the general order, and we think that it does, but we do also think it needs some tweaking and some maneuvering. The other quick point, and I'm running at my end, is composting operations at landfills. We want to make sure that they're within the WDRs that are established for that landfill and not required to do something beyond that. They're already very adequately covered. I think that the general order is trying to do that, but we have some tweaks that we would like to do. Thank you for your attention.
And make sure it's on. Push your button. It should be lit.
Okay, thank you. Madam Chairman, members of the board. My name is Jeff Creek, and I'm a co-founder of the Marine Carbon Project and a director of Rangeland and Agro-Ecosystem Management at the Carbon Cycle Institute. Staff was kind enough to call out the work I've been doing with those organizations, and I would just summarize basically the outcome of that work. We can anticipate sequestering about 1.5 billion metric tons of CO2e in California soils were we to thoroughly implement the governor's Healthy Soils Initiative, and that would also represent about 28 million acre-feet of additional water storage capacity in state soils. Having said that, though, I want to make it clear that today I'm here in my capacity as co-founder of the West Marine Compost Coalition, and I thought it would be helpful to share with you sort of a case study around what it means to develop a small community compost facility in California, or at least in Marin County. We convened in 1999 around the issues of local landfill closure, illegal roadside dumping, excessive labor costs, and fuel used to transport organics from west to east Marin for disposal, climate change, agricultural sustainability, and water quality impairment for nutrients and sediment in Tamales Bay. Recognizing the role that composting could play in addressing these issues, we began work on a regional model, basically. Our vision was of multiple facilities distributed across the West Marine landscape, serving local people by capturing local organic waste streams, processing them under controlled conditions, and redistributing the finished compost to meet local needs for nutrient management, carbon sequestration, water and soil quality enhancement, water conservation, erosion prevention, and climate change resilience. After 6 years of negotiating the political landscape of Marin County, we received a $565,000 USDA Conservation Innovation Grant. That ignited the county's support for the project. In 2011, after fully 12 years and an additional $1 million in grants and in-kind contributions, we finally opened our doors as a public-private partnership. We do not choose our waste streams. We take the organic waste the community generates, that is equestrian, dairy, and green waste, in approximately equal volumes, and we process it into compost that is approved as an organic input material by CDFA. After 4 years of operation, we continue to rely on significant volunteer labor and regular infusions of resources from our management partner. In short, our operation is not represented in the economic analysis in the WDR. And I don't think many small or medium facilities are, in fact, represented in that analysis. Yet if this WDR is adopted as drafted, the waiver will shutter our facility. And we believe many other rural community compost operations throughout the state. Citing new distributed community compost facilities, the very model we have identified as most appropriate for protection of natural resources, including water quality in our region, will be effectively impossible. Not because of any actual water quality impacts, but because these small community facilities rely heavily on volunteers, we have limited, if any, profit, and we certainly do not have the financial resources to comply with the monitoring and reporting requirements in the draft WDR. Particularly problematic for us, in our specific case, is the designation of manure as a Tier 2 feedstock. This conflicts directly with CalRecycle regulations, which designate manure as an agricultural material. The relegation of manure to Tier 2 places compost operations currently or proposing co-composting of manure under onerous monitoring requirements the cost of which can't be supported by marginally profitable facilities such as ours. This alone will shut us down. While across the state, the effect will be to decrease the composting of livestock manures in favor of increased direct land disposal with attendant water quality implications and lost opportunities for nutrient balancing and carbon sequestration, including, I would argue, within some of the most heavily impacted groundwater basins in the state. Comprehensive CalRecycle regulations already address composting operations. We are, in fact, regulated. While CalRecycle's authority does not explicitly include regulating water quality, as you well know, compost operations must meet CEQA requirements and were subject to regular inspection, in our case quarterly, and oversight by the local enforcement agency. In many cases, that LEA is the County Environmental Health Department, and we'd suggest these agencies are very qualified to identify a potential water quality problem and enforce its prevention or its abatement. There are many critical water quality issues in California, and I would argue that small community compost facilities are not among them. This WDR, however well-intentioned, and I believe it is well-intentioned, and we certainly support its intention, will result in negative impacts across our rural communities and undermine the potential for additional community compost facilities at precisely the moment when the need for them is clearly rapidly expanding. It flies in the face of the Governor's Healthy Soils Initiative, which is promoting compost production and use for water conservation, soil quality enhancement, and climate change mitigation. I have 3 specific recommendations for changes in the WDR that would be that would make or break our facility. One is to move livestock manure out of the Tier 2 category into Tier 1, consistent with CalRecycle definitions of agricultural materials. We would argue for allowing co-composting on-farm of off-farm Tier 1 materials, including livestock manure as redefined. This exemption should allow importation of up to 50% of total compost feedstock from off-farm. This is to enable proper carbon nitrogen, nutrient, bulk density, and moisture balancing of feedstocks for on-farm composting processes, and to enable expanded production and use of compost on-farm. And finally, most importantly for us, we ask for the exclusion from the WDR of all CalRecycle permitted compost facilities that are processing Tier 1 materials, including livestock manures, with not more than 12,500 cubic yards on site. This would be consistent with CalRecycle's notification tier for compost facilities. And with that, I'll close. Thank you very much.